Hey everybody, we are the Good Doctors of Abbey Research. I'm Dr. Erin.
I'm Dr. Kristen.
And we're here with our continuing coverage in October of things about women and/or suffrage we wanted to watch and wanted to talk about with you. So
we're workshopping the title. We'll let you guys know when we get it done.
Yeah, it goes into our online streaming category, which covers all ills these days. But this was, intentionally sort of crafted in the month of October to be about women and women's experiences. And towards the end, we're focusing on politics. So we did Shirley Chisholm's documentary last week. And this week we are on the filmed version of the Broadway play, What the Constitution Means to Me, by Heidi Screck.
Screck, I believe it is, yeah.
And it was a filmed performance, I believe, from 2019 that then just premiered on Amazon Prime Video, I think in the month of October. So Dr. Kristen is on Broadway watch and found out that it was coming on and was like, we should talk about it. So we are. And it's the film of the play in which she talks about her, to give you a brief summary, her experiences when she was like 15 in a competitive circuit, traveling the country, giving speeches about what the Constitution means to her to raise money for college. And she, because it was the early 1980s, paid for her whole college education by doing these competitive speeches. So it starts from that premise and then builds out into a whole exploration of what the Constitution does and does not say, most specifically about women's bodies and other marginalized groups a little bit, although she focuses in on women and specifically women who experience forms of violence. So it gets pretty heavy throughout. And then the tail end is a debate between her and a 15-year-old young person named Rosalie. I don't remember.
Oh, you said it, and now Rosalind is in my head, which is, I don't know if that's true or not. You keep talking, I will Google.
A young woman from New York, Rosalie, I think, who they debate whether or not to abolish or keep the Constitution. So that's the summary of it. We've just got a couple of comments about what we learned about the Constitution and some of the ideas that she teases out in this play, but we both thoroughly enjoyed it. It's very, very 100% worth watching for a lot of reasons, not the least of which I learned more about the Constitution than I knew before. I know I wrote her name down somewhere.
Yeah, I was about to say, this is a lot harder to Google than I thought it was going to be. Rosdelli.
Yes, that is correct. Forgive me, Rosdelli, for forgetting your name and now not being able to find where I wrote it down.
Yeah, sorry about that, Rosdelli. And then we were told that there was over the closing credits that it appears that in the 128 performances, sometimes this position was played by Rosdelli Ciprian, who is of Dominican heritage and ethnicity, as she tells us. So I know I'm butchering that last name because I'm not saying it with proper Dominican pronunciation. Apologies. And then somebody named Thursday Williams, who also seemed to be spitting fire. And both of them are competitive debaters in New York City. And if you are somebody who was not in a high school environment with competitive debate, think of the nerdiest, fieriest, most competitive, most articulate people that you have ever met, and they probably did debate in high school.
Yeah.
We are a certain breed. And
did you do competitive debate? Yeah, of course you did. I did not. Shocking no one.
It's actually one of the ways I learned to think so fast on my feet, because there was one competition I did where you got a half a point taken off every single time you did a vocal stop.
Wow.
It was intense and intimidating, and I cried afterwards because I lost several points. These young women did not. They were amazing.
Yeah, it's fire. It's the best, most positive way to end what at times is a very stark and sad exploration of the relationship to women from all kinds of groups and the Constitution. But yeah, I'm glad they ended with that kind of go get them. It reminded me of the end of the Museum of the American Revolution in Philly, where you go through this whole thing and then there's all these mirrors on the wall and it says like, you are the revolution. And you're like, yes, I am and you like walk out of this and you're like, I am the revolution. So I X'd out of this window, like I have my own constitution.
So in terms of the reality of women's lived experiences in the United States, it's very stark and very realistic, unfortunately. It would be easy because Heidi performs very dramatically and she yells a lot of her way through this, which is going to feel very awkward on video, but would not have felt awkward in the theater. And this is one of the potential downsides of filmed live experiences, especially with a stage show. I'm actually quite worried about this because I believe they filmed Jeff Daniels in To Kill a Mockingbird. And he yelled a lot, and he had to because the Schubert Theater is big. And projection mics in terms of plays and musicals are slightly different too. You want a different echo, you want a different relationship with sound in plays. And so I'm afraid that if we ever actually get that recording of Jeff Daniels, people are not going to understand the magic he spun within the room, which Dr. Aaron and I got to experience and was very, very powerful. So I would imagine, like, I was not necessarily moved to tears the way that the audience members were entirely by Heidi's performance. And some of that was because it was built for people in the room and not built for us.
Yeah. So watch it with that grain of salt. And that's a really valuable dramatological analysis that Dr. Kristen brought up when we were talking about it offline that I hadn't necessarily considered. But it's certainly important to remember that even though it was on film, it was not intended to be seen on film.
Correct. And so she constructs it very large and very loud, and that's great. That's wonderful. Yeah. But I think it would be easy for people that enter into this with a level of skepticism to then assume that her words are dramatic as well, or potentially exaggerated. And not only as somebody who has spent many years studying women, and I believe if you have been watching our YouTube channel, you understand that we spend a lot of time thinking about the legal status of women, not only in the United States, but around the world. Again, my PhD was about women in the United Kingdom province of Northern Ireland. But I also have some small experience working in domestic violence as part of my social work degree. And so I would like to, before we really get to talk about this, tell you that 0 things that she said in this production surprised me. Mm-hmm. I've heard those stories before. I love people that have lived those stories, and many of you do as well. Yeah. One of the greatest gifts I think we can give ourselves as Americans, to be completely honest, is to learn the stories of our ancestors. The most arresting part of this for me was at one point she read the headlines from her hometown, essentially, of somewhere in Washington State, from one week in which it was 5 headlines of 5 acts of exceptionally extreme violence against women.
Yeah.
And what I would say now in response to that is, yes, the 1800s was harsh for everybody and it was even worse, but it's not necessarily better now.
It's not.
I haven't heard recently of anybody getting stomped to death with boot spikes, but I have heard of footballers' wives being beaten with football cleats.
Yeah, and she tells and then there's a scene where and we'll get to more the role of the other person on stage, the man on stage, but there's a scene where his character reads out laws that don't protect women from all different periods of history. But she does go into some modern statistics as well. And a couple of them that, just because you said it just now, Kristen, that I want to say out loud for our viewers. But 4 women are murdered every day by their male partners in the United States. In the 21st century, more American women have been killed by their male partners than Americans have died in any wars, including 9/11. And that is just the women, and she makes this point really rightly so. Those are just the women that were killed by their male partners.
Those are the women killed by the men who were supposed to love them.
Who were supposed to love them. Not the random acts of violence or not so random acts of violence when there's not an emotional connection or relationship between those people.
And that statistic also does not include children who are killed by their parents.
Yeah. So there's a lot of sobering statistics in here, but you better believe she has those receipts. So it's a huge part of like sitting with that reality as she's talking about it. And she doesn't leave you a lot of time to sit with stuff because she's very fast paced, which is, I think, effective, because otherwise we'd all be like sitting there staring in silence. But it's really important to understand not only that historical context, but the contemporary context as well, that like we live under this veiled perception that things are better now. And in a lot of ways they are. You know, I don't think it's legally allowed for men to rape their wives.
No, it is actually finally made illegal in the early 1990s.
Yeah, so that's better. There are things that are better. We can
women can own property now. We can have our own credit cards. I can get birth control without my husband.
We have bodily autonomy for now. But it's just because we have made, and she has a great analogy about progress, just because we have made progress doesn't mean we don't have progress to make.
Yeah, and I will say, if I was going to summarize this entire procedure for people, it would be that the Constitution we have has to be a living document, mm-hmm. because it was within itself, within the text itself, it was built. The mechanism to change it was built in. Mm-hmm. The founders therefore acknowledged that there was always going to be room to grow. And these men who owned other human beings, who routinely cheated on their wives, who were not fantastic parents, according to some of the memoirs we have, who were, in other words, human beings, mm-hmm. looked at the laws of Europe and said, you know, one of the problems with that is that nobody has a way to change anything. Yeah. They looked at the last time that the fact that in the 1700s, the English government was largely still ruled by the Magna Carta from the 13th century. And they said, you know what we should do? We should make sure we can fix this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's a huge part of where she gets to in the end. Right. And the phrase she says is, you know, we were given the tools for our own correction. What has happened is we're not using them.
Correct. And so the issue about social change, which needs to happen, and I have yet to meet a single human being that doesn't believe we have to change things. So I believe that's a fairly universal statement. The Constitution itself is not designed to protect every citizen the way we think it does. The Constitution is more complicated than we give it credit for. Mm-hmm. It is also more straightforward than we give it credit for, and we read in too much to a certain extent. There are things that we hold sacrosanct in this country that are in fact cultural norms and not laws. Mm-hmm. And what it really boils down to is that we have a constitution that entire job is about like telling the government what their job is and not about guaranteeing freedom. And think about the difference in that. Think about what it means to start from a place of, sure, everybody has the exact same amount of freedoms, which we all know is a lie, but that's the position they started with. Mm. So they started with the positioning of limiting government intervention in people's lives.
Yeah.
That's a different posture than saying the government's job is to guarantee your freedom.
Yeah.
Which is how I was told.
Yeah. And I mean, that's what's so valuable about this exercise that she goes through, right? Is it's a myth busting exercise.
Yep. And we love those.
We love those. We're spending a lot of time on them in the year of our Lord 2020, which has been very instructive for both of us and hopefully for you guys as well. But she spends a little bit of time on this idea that Dr. Kristen's teased out here. And legally, it's constitutional scholars, it's called negative rights versus positive rights, which is a legalistic way of saying what Dr. Kristen just said. But we are taught that the Constitution is positive right framing, telling us what we have, whereas it's actually telling the government what it can't have. And like she says, really, and I wrote it down because I loved it. You know, it was designed and written by men to protect them, so the men who made it, and their property from the government.
Yep.
That was the guiding principle on this assumption that all humans were created equal, although we do know that they only meant, property owning white men at the time.
And some of them did and some of them didn't. And that's what's really interesting. Like, so for instance, one of the very first amendments put forward after the Bill of Rights was by Ben Franklin. It was about the abolition of slavery because he hated that was that. So the framers are also not a monolith the way that we talk about them.
Correct.
Yeah.
But yeah, for me, there were a couple lessons about constitutional structures that and there's a real difference between the way we frame ideas about what we want our country to be and the beliefs that we have about what American democracy represents and the actual laws of American democracy. And a lot of times we apply what we believe about our country to the laws, and there's disconnect between those because they were written, and certainly the Constitution was a document of its time, and all the amendments are as well. And you can go back to our coverage on suffrage to talk about why the 19th Amendment was written the way it was during that period of American history. So all the amendments are shaped by the historical context that they were written in as well, which is also not something we're really taught.
No, and it's a very, one of the questions that they've asked every single Supreme Court justice in my lifetime in their confirmation hearings is, are you a literalist? Mm-hmm. A constitutional literalist? And the last 3 justices appointed, well, the last 2, and then the one that appears as we record this to be on a fast track to confirmation, have been constitutional literalists. Mm-hmm. And that is a diametrically opposed viewpoint to not only the one that Heidi presents within this thing, but also, just fair warning, the one that we hold. We are not constitutional literalists. And I often tell people that when they are engaging in conversations about faith with Christians and different churches and different things like that, the conversation that everything boils down to is, are you a biblical literalist? Or do you believe it's more of a living document and words of their time, as it were? And the answer to that question will tell you just about everything else about how they enact their faith. And I have become increasingly convinced that, are you a constitutional literalist? Is the core question for American citizens. Yeah. What do you believe about the Constitution? What fundamentally, do you think that those men were men of their time and they gave us some really good ideas that we need to fix? Or do you think that they were perfect in their understanding and that we need to mind read them back in order to prepare our future? And that's the differences, really. I'm not trying to sound trite or judgy. Those are the differences. Do you want to interpret the words or do you want to interpret the men? Mm-hmm. And that's your choice. And this documentary, this film, this performance, I think of it as a documentary because it was so non-fictional in a lot of ways. But the emotions of the performance are so clear about some of the implications of that decision for how you view your citizenship. Mm-hmm. I don't want to get into the stories that she told about her family because I actually just want you to go watch this. And I'd like you to sit with the stories of her family. We talk a lot about empathy watches. This is both an educational and an empathy watch. We work with some interns at a couple universities, and we will be asking them to watch this in the future for sure, to ask them to sit with other people's life experiences and pains. And her story never, ever shocked me, like I said, but it certainly grieved me. But at the very end, the very last thing we see is actually from Thursday Williams. And who was one of the other performers that we did not see the entire performance of. And she gives the most rousing 3 minutes of my week in which she says, you are your own constitution and amend it from yourself out. And that's my new favorite way of saying, be the change you want to see in the world.
Yeah.
So friends, write your own constitution.
Go write it. Go advocate for the change that you want to see in the world and figure out how you can be a catalyst for it.
And make sure you include your own process of how to do amendments.
Correct. Make sure that you build in the tools for your own correction, as Heidi coined for us. I think that's the crux of what we wanted to say about this. please watch it. If you do and you have thoughts you want to share, we would always love to hear from you. So comment below if you saw it live, if you watched this on Amazon Prime, whatever. And we will see you. We've got a couple more weeks before The Crown hits. So
They keep teasing us.
Next week, we'll be back with another online streaming thing we think you should watch. So until then, we'll see you guys.